Welcome to Ray-ality TV. I'm Raymond Bakari. This episode is continuing my coverage of the growing field of candidates running to replace outgoing Congressman David Cicilline in the 1st Congressional District here in Rhode Island. One of those candidates that is joining me today is Aaron Regunberg, who is a former state representative and ran for lieutenant governor in 2018. Aaron, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great, and thanks for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's great to be here.
Why do you want to represent Rhode Island in Congress?
Well, I'm running because I think we need more leaders in Congress who can organize and bring people together and have a record of winning real change. That's the work I've been doing here in Rhode Island, leading passage of legislation like paid sick days and winning higher wages and creating new clean energy programs. And that's really the work that I want to do in Washington. I feel a lot of urgency in this moment. My wife and I have a 2-year-old, and like a lot of parents, I worry about the future. Will our kids be safe at school from guns and mass shootings? Will they have clean air to breathe? Will they be able to afford housing and healthcare and college? And these concerns, they make me furious, honestly, because it's not an accident that more kids die from guns here than anywhere else on the planet, right? It's not an accident that our climate is spiraling out of control. It's not an accident that so many working people are struggling now while corporate profits are hitting literal record highs. The gun industry, fossil fuel companies, corporate CEOs, and their Republican allies are creating and feeding these problems because they're making billions and billions of dollars off of them. But I really believe that it doesn't have to be this way. I'm running for Congress because I believe we can come together and take on those kinds of entrenched interests and win. And the reason I know that that's possible is because I've seen it here in Rhode Island. I've been a part of winning real substantial policy change that makes a difference in people's lives. And that's, I think, the kind of leadership that we need in Washington right now.
And there are about, I think, over 15 candidates now seeking the seat in this primary. It's likely that
You
you're
should
all going
consider jumping in.
I can't. I don't live in the district. I'm 21. Rule me out of that list. But anyways, so yeah, there's over 15 running, and you're likely all going to have similarities in what policies you favor. But what differentiates you from your opponents?
Well, I do. I mean, I do think there are some differences in policy and values. I'm the only candidate in the race that has a record of fighting for Medicare for all, for universal health care. I'm the only candidate in the race that has a history of taking on the fossil fuel industry, that's been talking about the need for a Green New Deal since before it was cool. But I think at the core, what I bring to the table in this race is a record over a decade now of fighting to make an actual difference for regular Rhode Islanders and being able to win real change, including on a lot of issues that a lot of people didn't think were possible. I remember when I was first elected to the General Assembly, a lot of people said we would never pass paid sick days. There are too many corporations and conservative lawmakers lined up against it. But we organized, we brought workers and small businesses and unions together. I organized my legislative colleagues. We found the leverage points and we figured out how to get it done. So previously it was 40% of working Rhode Islanders who couldn't afford paid sick days can now, take a day off to care for a loved one or recover from an illness. And that's the same approach, the same way that we were able to win the first increase in the tip minimum wage in our state in 20 years and new clean energy, community solar, virtual net metering programs. That's the same way that we passed harm reduction strategies to prevent overdose for folks struggling with addiction. That's the same way that we started the fight to reform solitary confinement, which continues to this day. In all of these different campaigns and fights, there were obstacles, there were entrenched interests who were standing in the way, but we brought people together, including people who didn't always agree with me, and figured out how to get it done. And I think that's the kind of work that as I look at Washington right now, it feels like we really need.
One thing I've noticed from a lot of the announcements from a couple of the candidates is they bring up that they'll continue the fight that Congressman Cicilline has put forth for a number of issues similar to, fighting for the environment, the right to choose, protecting our democracy, the whole nine yards. But in what ways would you differ as a congressperson?
Well, I mean, I think there's a reason that everyone um, is trying to feel connected to Congressman Cicilline. It's because he's done, in my opinion, a really great job. I think for me, I've been really grateful to just be able to feel confident that our rep was not just on the right side of issues, but effective in actually moving an agenda and using the platform in the different ways you can to call out the extremist Republicans who are attacking our rights, attacking our freedoms, and move a positive agenda that'll have a difference for folks. This is the opposite of answering your question, which I'll get to. But one area that I've been particularly grateful, seeing Congressman Cicilline's leadership on the House Judiciary Committee, really kind of reviving the whole antitrust agenda. It used to be a big plank of the Democratic Party that we were the party for small business, for competition, against these mega corporations that get so powerful that they can stifle competition, that they can raise prices without having to worry about competition, that they can bring the hammer down on workers. And I think that those are really important issues. Congressman Cicilline has led the way in a lot of ways. And I think with him moving on, it's really important that our next rep really continue that work. Congressman Cicilline, I think, has been a strong member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. I think that that this is not a huge difference, but I think that I would take a focus there even to a next level, as far as trying to contribute to the organizing work that's happening in that space to sort of build a stronger collective bloc that can really help shape the agenda of the larger House Democratic Caucus. That's a lot of the work that I did when I was in the State House, working to organize progressive legislators to have a collective agenda. In 2017 and 2018, we called it the Fair Shot Agenda. And we got over 25 reps to come together, stand behind a podium. And by the way, in the House, 25 it's a key number. That's the number you need to be able to block a budget. So leadership is very keyed in on that. And so we got over that number to come together and say, these are our shared priorities, X, Y, and Z, with, there's sort of a implicit threat there that if we don't see some real movement on those issues, there could be an issue with the budget. And so that kind of internal organizing work is definitely, I think, going to be a priority for me, because I think that's the only way that we can really push for the bolder, more ambitious changes that I think the Democratic Party needs to be fighting for.
Now, looking at some key policy goals and issues on voters' minds for this special election, one of them is definitely going to be addressing gun violence. For those who are unfamiliar with your platform, what are some specific policies you would support?
I mean, this is such a key issue. It comes up in every room that I've been in since this campaign started. We're just seeing this barbarity day in and day out, and the idea that anyone can watch these tragedies, watch these families torn apart, watch these children and not feel moved to take action. I have trouble getting into the minds of Republicans who are blocking this common sense gun violence prevention efforts. And it's an issue that I think touches all of us. 2 months ago, my wife and toddler and I were walking like a block and a half from our house, and there was 60 seconds after we had passed an intersection, we heard shots fired, and we came back, there was police tape and shells on the ground, literally where we'd been a minute before. So it touches all of us. There were a number of issues I fought for when I was in the State House. I introduced the high capacity magazine ban every year that I was elected, which has now finally become law. We've made some good progress here in Rhode Island. At the federal level, there's so much to do, right? We need to be getting military style weapons off our streets, banning assault weapons, banning high capacity magazines. We need a national gun license registry. We need universal background checks. We need to be cracking down on gun dealers and the loopholes that they have to get around the laws that currently exist. We need to be closing the weird, I'm a lawyer now, And it's just stunning to me that we have carved out the gun industry as the one industry that does not have to face any legal liability for the impacts of its products. These families that are torn apart by gun violence, they have no legal course. You can't sue a gun company for selling an item that is then used to murder your family, which is absurd. And then the last thing, we're talking about these different regulatory answers, which are really important. I think we also need to be exploring the non-regulatory side of this. There are community violence intervention programs that are really successful. We have here in Rhode Island, we have the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence. We've seen the impact that those programs have. And so I think fighting for more funding for those kind of programs where they exist, creating new ones, taking them to scale around the country, I think is another piece of the puzzle.
At this point in time, it's currently a Republican-led House, which you kind of talked about in that answer, and it's also a conservative Supreme Court, so there's not really many actions that can be done in the judicial branch. So in between now and whenever the Democrats pick up the House, what could actually be done when it comes to this issue?
Well, first of all, I do think, the unfortunate answer, part of the unfortunate answer is to win gun violence prevention, we do need to take back Congress. And so a big part of the fight is electorally. I do believe we're going to win back control in 2024 because I think Republicans are not offering anything to working people right now. I mean, they're peddling, these electoral lies. And really, it seems to me their whole strategy is how can we distract folks so that they don't notice the fact that we're taking away their fundamental rights. How can we try to put the blame for the pain that people are feeling with rising costs, with economic inequality on immigrants and trans folks? They're trying to sow division and hate between regular people. And I think voters are smart. And ultimately, there's a majority of folks who are going to see past that. I think two parts to that answer. I do think that ultimately we're not going to see the kind of change we need until we have organized enough people and built enough power to be able to take on the very powerful gun industry and the advocacy groups, the NRA, that it funds through the billions of dollars that it makes. In Rhode Island, we've seen this. For anyone who's engaged in this work, about the different colored shirts, right? When I was first elected to the state house, every gun hearing day, you could kind of tell the balance of power based on the number of people who showed up to the state house in yellow shirts, which were all the anti-gun control people, and then the number of people who showed up in red and orange shirts for the Coalition Against Gun Violence and Moms Demand Action. And when I was first elected, it was always like overwhelmingly yellow on those days. And as year by year, the balance of power started to shift, and we had more and more orange and more red shirts. And this year's hearing days, when I was up at the state house, it seemed to me that we had more folks in red and orange than yellow. And I think that's been a key part of how we've been able to win some significant legislative victories in Rhode Island. It's a matter of organizing and bringing out volunteers, bringing out parents who are concerned about their children's safety. And we need to figure out how to be taking that to scale, and we can do that, whether Republicans are in power or Democrats. We need to be doing that organizing work. And I do think that there's value in the kind of advocacy measures and tools that can really put a spotlight on what is actually happening and what is at stake. I think a lot of us were, so proud when we saw our Congressman David Cicilline on the House floor sitting in with Congressman John Lewis, making a statement, making a stand, putting a spotlight on the moral dimensions of this fight. And so I think continuing to call out the BS of Republicans when they're shilling for the NRA and the gun industry is another piece of the work.
I'm glad you brought up the people with the yellow shirts, because that actually plays into a follow-up I had. So your district, although it's overwhelmingly blue, voted for Joe Biden by 20 something points, there are still pockets of the pro 2A crowd in that district. Alongside your Barringtons and Providence and Pawtuckets, you still have Tiverton, North Smithfield, folks who are likely going to be pro 2A and are probably concerned that their Second Amendment rights is being stifled. How do you plan to talk to that crowd and also adequately represent them?
I mean, I think that like the truth is overwhelming majorities of Americans, including gun owners, support the kind of common sense measures that I was talking about. Not everyone, but like most people, including most people who use guns for hobbies, for other uses, also care about the safety of their kids at school. They also, they also want public spaces to be places we can feel comfortable. They are also, I think, disgusted and shamed when you turn on the TV and once again we're seeing a story about children being gunned down. So I think there's space for these kinds of conversations. In 2018, when I ran for lieutenant governor statewide, we actually won in a lot of the rural communities. Smithfield, Foster, Gloucester. Those were a lot of places where, even though we were running on a strong progressive platform, we were successful. And so in my experience in that race, when I was just spending time in every community in the state, I was really struck by how similar conversations were, whichever city or town I was in. Like most people want the same things, right? They want their kids to be safe and have opportunities. They want their families to be healthy. Everyone wants clean air to breathe and clean water to drink, and an environment that is green and conducive to being safe and healthy. And so, there's a lot of forces that are in this country right now and in this state that are trying to sow division. But in my experience, people have the same concerns and priorities. And I think the work is having real conversations, meeting people where they're at, and explaining how we're like, and I think sometimes I get caught in this trap too. But it's like, how do we get out of talking in platitudes and vagaries and actually like be having real conversations about the solutions that we're fighting for the real problems that people are facing right now, because people are facing real problems. People are struggling, and they need government to do a better job for regular people, not just for the people who can write big campaign checks and hire corporate lobbyists to roam the halls of Congress, right?
Now, moving on to the cost of living crisis, your website has an extensive part of this on the campaign platform talking about how you would take on this issue. Can you explain what this would look like legislatively, taking on the cost of living crisis?
Yeah, this is one of the other issues that everywhere I go, folks bring it up. Folks are feeling it. My wife and I are feeling the squeeze with daycare and health insurance and diapers and grocery costs, and our utility bill. It's like, wow. I think that this is another area where it's really important that we remember that inflation doesn't just happen. Like, we often talk about inflation like it's this like almost quasi-religious force that is just out there. No, these are price hikes that are made by corporate decision makers, right? And I think there's a lot of things that we can do to use policy to bring the cost of living crisis down. We should remember that as regular people are struggling right now, corporate profits are at record highs. Like, big corporations are literally making more money than they ever have. And that's not an accident. We need laws to stop corporations from price gouging. We need price controls on vital goods, on necessary prescription drugs, particularly the ones that our tax dollars went into developing, but then somehow, big pharma companies come along and they raise the price by like 12,000%. It's wild. We need windfall profits tax. This is something that Senator Whitehouse has proposed specifically for the fossil fuel industry, but the industries that are profiting off of our pain in like historic ways, should have to pay some of that money to support the folks who are struggling right now. And we talked about monopoly and antitrust, but I think that's a big piece of it too, right? It is not disconnected that we are at a point in our economic situation in history where we have so many mega corporations that are so large, they can set prices basically however high they want, and they don't have to worry about competition because we've stifled that competition. And so I think the kind of measures that Congressman Cicilline was advocating for around reining in corporate monopolies is another piece of the inflation work. The last thing I'll say on when it comes to inflation and cost of living, I do think that a lot of the approach that has been taken is really backwards. You know, the Fed has this one big hammer of interest rate hikes, and you know the old saying, when you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you try to resolve inflation by basically tanking the economy and putting us into a recession, you are putting all of the burden for resolving inflation on working people, on poorer people who are going to lose their jobs, who are going to be, you know, in even worse off shape. And that's particularly unjust when, as we just discussed, like that's not actually the main source of the problem right now. And so I think we need to be approaching this not as a aggregate demand problem, because there's a lot of economic research showing that that's not the case. This is a corporate profiteering issue, and we should be trying to solve it as such.
You'll likely hear from, you'll likely hear from the Republicans if you're elected. They'll cite the increased federal spending, and they'll cite that we're already in debt, and then when you spend more, the money becomes valueless, thus creating inflation. What would your response be to when you hear those? Because I know you're on the side of saying this is price gouging.
Yeah, I think that there's a whole lot of economic data that shows that that aggregate demand, which is, you know, the problem of too many dollars chasing not enough supply, that is really not what has been driving the current problem. And again, I think it is always really hypocritical when Republicans talk about the debt, talk about these issues. You know, we're in this debt ceiling standoff right now. And that to me is incredibly frustrating, because the Republican Party has raised the debt ceiling dozens of times to fund their trillion-dollar wars, which, by the way, we never hear about the inflationary effects of military spending and wars, only for some reason the inflationary effect of, you know, spending on families to help folks who are struggling. They have raised the debt ceiling to fund their, you know, massive tax cuts for billionaires and corporations, which we also never talk about that in inflationary terms when it also has an inflationary effect. So they don't actually care about the deficit and the debt. I think it's pretty clear. They are using these issues as a means of going after workers and seniors and children, the people who rely on the kind of programs that they are trying to cut in this current standoff. You know, they're going after nutrition assistance programs for seniors and single moms. They're going after Head Start seats and Pell Grants and the provisions in the IRA, the climate provisions that just passed that are, you know, creating jobs in our communities. So that's why this week we put out a call calling on President Biden and congressional Democrats to stand firm on this. These people are trying to drive our economy off of a cliff, and we shouldn't be giving into that. And I do think that there are alternative solutions. In our call that we put out yesterday, we talked about the 14th Amendment. The Section 4 of the 14th Amendment says that the validity of the United States debt shall not be questioned. And there's a lot of very accomplished legal scholars who say that that the meaning of that seems pretty clear, that the president can evoke that authority to make sure that if Republicans insist on continuing with this brinksmanship, that we continue paying our bills as they come due, that we continue executing the spending laws that Congress has already passed, right? There are already laws in place that Congress has passed saying we need to spend X, Y, and Z, and to cut that off is breaking those laws.
We're also not seeing the wages catch up with the inflation and cost of goods going up either. To my understanding, you're also in favor of raising the federal minimum wage, correct?
Absolutely.
In terms of dollar amount, what would be the dollar amount you would go for? I know we're hearing 15, but now we're even hearing folks say we need to go to 19 because 15 is not going to be enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at what the minimum wage should be, if it had been adjusted for inflation since the 60s, I think it would be at like, I shouldn't say a number because I don't actually have the exact number in my head, but I think it's like $24, something like that. You know, many, many times what it is. It is shameful that we have not increased the federal minimum wage in as long as we have. It's like, it kind of boggles the mind. So I think, I think we absolutely need to get it to 15 and adjust it to inflation. I think there's very, very good arguments that it should be higher than that. I think there's maybe arguments that in different places based on cost of living in different regions that there could be some differentiation, but we should be, pushing for a wage that people can actually live and thrive on and support their kids on. Because anything other than that, I think is barbaric, to be honest.
So start off 15 and then go to a higher amount after the adjusting of inflation is done to see what it would be.
Yeah, and I think there's a very good argument that yeah, we should be pushing for beyond 15. Absolutely.
I want to talk about congressional term limits for a moment. It's something very interesting to talk about, especially when we look at Rhode Island. Both of the Congress people who have just left or about to leave recently served quite a bit of time. And then in the Senate, we're seeing senators like Senator Feinstein be there for quite a while, and that's causing a bit of controversy because of the health issues. Where do you stand on term limits for members of Congress?
Yeah, I'm in favor of a whole bunch of different measures to bring more little d democratic accountability back into our political system, back into our legislative system. I think term limits is absolutely one of those priorities that can make a difference. I think it's interesting to bring up Senator Feinstein and what's happening there. That's actually, I think, a really good argument for that particular policy. I don't think that that's like the only or even maybe the most important of these kinds of priorities for me. When I think about what is making our government not work like it should, the biggest issue is the corrupting influence of big money, corporate money in our political system. And it's an issue I've been working on for years at the state level. It's why in this campaign, we right from the start committed that we wouldn't take a penny from corporate PACs, and we put out a challenge to every other candidate in the race, hoping that whoever wins, they're going to be accountable just to the people of the district, not to these big corporations. So I think that that issues of reining in corporate spending in our political system, so that it's not just the people who can write the biggest checks that get to decide the rules of the game in Washington, is really, really, really important.
Sticking with the term limits, though, is there a specific number or amount of years you would like to see it be if it were to be set into place?
I don't have an exact, I have not done enough specific work on that to or looked at different research on what makes the most sense. So I would want to do a little more research before I gave a specific number.
But you favor the idea in general, though, correct?
Yeah.
Got it. You also, sticking with term limits, you mentioned on your website that you support term limits for Supreme Court justices. In your opinion, why are those needed?
So I think we've all been really shook to our core to see the kind of explicit corruption that has been coming out recently. And, our own Senator Whitehouse has been ringing this bell and sounding this alarm for a while, often pretty lonely. And it's good to see it starting to get the kind of attention that it deserves. Last week, we put out a call that joining the call for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas to be impeached. I mean, seeing the, again, explicitly unethical behavior that he's been engaged in, it really calls into question the legitimacy of our highest court. But talking about term limits, I think the Clarence Thomas scandals are, that's not the problem. That's sort of a symptom of deeper problems. And so we do need some deeper policy solutions. The core issue here, in my opinion, is that the judiciary, which is the least democratically accountable branch of our government, right? It's got the least democratic safeguards, has in recent years been coming to wield outsized power and doing it in ways that are really unrepresentative and unaccountable. And so the question is, how do we bring the judiciary back into the system of checks and balances that the founders intended? And I think that the legislature and the executive branch have a real responsibility and role to play when the courts are getting out of control, when judges are holding themselves above the law, when judges like the Texas Trump nominee, who last month tried to limit national access to critical abortion medication. When we're starting to see this kind of unaccountable wielding of power, we need to get them back under control. And there are measures that have been proposed, things like term limits for Supreme Courts, things like requiring a supermajority of Supreme Court members to strike down legislation that was passed by, again, little d, democratically elected legislators. Things like binding the Supreme Court by the same code of ethics that other federal judges, that the federal judge I just clerked for this last year is bound by. Things like not allowing a single district court judge to issue a nationwide injunction like we saw with the abortion medication last month. So I think there's a hesitancy among a lot of Democrats to get involved in these fights, and there's sort of a sense of like, oh, the judiciary is sacred in some way. We can't be touching it. But it's not. It is one more branch of government. It is one more piece of the system of checks and balances that our Constitution envisioned. And our Constitution envisioned the different branches working in relation to each other to make sure that none of them were starting to engage in the kind of behavior that we're seeing out of the courts right now, and specifically the right-wing takeover of the courts. And so I think, again, it's been great having Senator Whitehouse really like leading this charge in the Senate. One of my motivations for getting in this race is that I think we need more folks on the House side who are doing that same kind of really active, effective advocacy on these issues.
We're also seeing calls to increase the number of Supreme Court justices. Currently, it's 9, and to my understanding, there's no set precedent of the number, so you could just pass a piece of legislation and then increase the number. I believe Congressman Cicilline, he either co-sponsored or sponsored the bill to increase it alongside Congressman Nadler. Are you in favor of adding more Supreme Court justices?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the number 9 is mentioned nowhere in the Constitution. It has the number has changed and been increased many times over the years, and it does seem like this is another time when it's about time for that to happen.
This next one I have is a little bit away from policy issues, but one that I really want to ask as a Gen Zer myself, and also because I'm working on a project about their political representation. So we're seeing how they're participating at record rates and off-year elections, presidential year elections. They might even be participating in big numbers during this special election in Congress and even during this campaign. How do you plan to not only hear Gen Z, but also adequately represent them?
I mean, one of the things that gives me hope in this moment and in, a political landscape that in a lot of ways, as I talked about, is really scary and infuriating, is the activism and leadership and growing turnout in Gen Z. And I think for Democrats, the issue is really, we need to be giving young voters a reason to turn out. Because I think certainly strong majorities, if they turn out, are going to vote Democratic. I think Gen Z voters are smart enough to not be falling for the Republican crap for the most part. But among a lot of young people that I talk to, and I understand this myself as a millennial, who feels a lot of existential dread when I think about the future, when I think about the climate crisis and the kind of world and planet that my son's going to grow up in, when I think about the threats to our democracy, when I think about the attacks on reproductive rights, on democratic rights, when I think about the many times that the Democratic Party has let me down and the values that I care about, whether it's universal health care or bold climate action. I think there's a lot of young people right now who are pretty disillusioned, and they don't feel a lot of reasons to have hope in our political system. And I understand that very much, because I have my dark moments and days when when I frankly can feel pretty similarly. But I also know that, like, those are the feelings that the other side wants us to feel, right? The gun industry, the fossil fuel industry, Exxon, Chevron, like, Republicans, they want young people to be feeling dispirited and like they never can get any change, and there's no point in engaging, because then they win. Then those interests win and we lose, and folks who want a livable future lose. And I think, we have seen big wins under Democratic leadership the last few years. There have been a lot of things that have not gone far enough. There have been things that decisions that have disappointed me, but we've seen the difference between Democratic leadership and Republican leadership. And so, in our campaign, we're going to be trying to engage and organize and reach out to young folks. And I think and give young folks a reason to feel like they have a stake in this election, which they do. And I think that's the kind of work that the Democratic Party in general needs to continue prioritizing, and never, ever taking younger voters for granted, because when we do that, we're going to lose.
I have a couple of lightning round to get through some of those topics quickly, like statehood for DC and Puerto Rico and things of that nature. Starting off with that one, do you support or oppose statehood for Washington, DC and Puerto Rico?
Absolutely support.
Banning members of Congress from trading stocks, are you in favor of or opposed to that idea?
Absolutely. It is wild that that is still allowed.
We now know that President Biden will officially seek re-election for president in 2024. Do you plan to support his candidacy?
Yes.
And lastly, for this section, who is one member of Congress that you look the most forward to working with?
So someone who I've really, really appreciated, we talked about wanting to be a part of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and that organizing, and I've been really impressed with Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal's leadership of the CPC. She's really been trying to turn that into this effective body, and I've appreciated that. I know that Congressman Cicilline has appreciated that, and I would love to, work with her in supporting that work.
My final question is on the non-political end of things. In your opinion, what do you think Rhode Island is best known for?
What is Rhode Island best known for? This isn't what I would like us to be best known for. When I'm like out of state and I mention I'm from Rhode Island, people that fact that is not a real fact, but that how much smaller we are at high tide than low tide is something that I hear a lot. I think that what I'm excited for us to be known for moving forward is being a leader in this clean energy transition, whether you're talking about, having some of the most ambitious emissions reduction goals, whether you're talking about having pioneered the offshore wind industry and now continuing to lead the way on that front. I think it's already starting to happen, and in future years, I'm excited to go somewhere out of state and have people say, Rhode Island, those are the folks that are showing us what we need to do on climate.
That was all the questions I had, and I think that's a good place to end things. Aaron, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure of mine to have you on the show.
It's been really great to talk. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, and absolutely anytime. And thank you for watching this episode of Ray-ality TV. If you want to see future episodes as soon as they're posted on this channel, please click the subscribe button down below and the post notification bell icon to the right of it. I'm Raymond Bakari. I'll see you next time.